My neighbor Frank came over on a Sunday morning last week. 76 years old, a retired engineer, on the age pension since 2019, sharp as anything, reads the paper every morning and watches the news every night, the kind of man who thinks he's across everything that affects his retirement. He knocked on my door holding a printout and said an online pension calculator told him he should be getting more than he currently receives, and he wanted to know if that could possibly be right. I looked at his numbers and my stomach dropped, because he was right. Frank had been leaving money on the table, not through carelessness, but because the rules that applied when he retired are not the rules that apply today, and nobody ever sent him a letter explaining what changed or what it meant for him. Welcome back to my channel. This is Australia Pension Hub, and today's video is specifically for anyone who retired before 2020, because what I'm about to walk you through involves real money that may be sitting unclaimed in your Centrelink assessment right now. By the time Frank and I finished talking, he had a clear picture of exactly what he was owed and exactly what to do about it. By the end of this video, you will too. Let's get into it. To understand why so many people who retired before 2020 are missing out, you need to understand a decision the government made in May 2020 and why its ending earlier this year changed everything. When the COVID pandemic hit and the Reserve Bank slashed official interest rates to historic lows, the federal government froze deeming rates. For anyone unfamiliar, deeming rates are the fixed assumed rates of return Centrelink applies to your financial assets when working out your pension income. Rather than checking what your savings genuinely earn, Centrelink assumes a set rate of return and counts that assumed figure as your income for the income test. Before the freeze, the lower deeming rate sat at 0.75%, and the upper rate at 2.75%. Once the freeze took hold in May 2020, those rates dropped to historic lows, 0.25% for the lower rate and 2.25% for the upper rate, and they stayed locked there for just over 5 years. This mattered enormously for people who retired before 2020, because during those years, savings and term deposit interest rates were often well below even those frozen deeming rates, meaning Centrelink was assuming your money earned more than it actually did, and your pension was reduced accordingly. But the freeze also limited the damage, because deeming rates couldn't rise even as the Reserve Bank began lifting official rates aggressively from 2022 onward. Pensioners were shielded from the full effect of rising rates on their pension calculation. Then, on the 20th of September 2025, the freeze ended for the first time, with deeming rates lifting by 0.5%, the lower rate to 0.75 and the upper rate to 2.75. On the 20th of March 2026, they rose again by another 0.5%, the lower rate now sitting at 1.25% and the upper rate at 3.25%. In just 6 months, deeming rates roughly doubled from their frozen lows, and for pensioners holding significant financial assets, particularly those who retired before 2020 and built up savings over decades, that shift has had a real, measurable effect on their payment. Let's make this concrete, because this is where it becomes very real for a lot of people watching. Say you retired before 2020 and hold roughly $300,000 in savings and term deposits. Under the frozen rates that applied until September 2025, your total deemed income sat at roughly $5,500 to $6,000 a year, somewhere around $220 to $230 a fortnight. Under the current rates from March 2026, that deemed income climbs to roughly $9,000 to $9,500 a year, closer to $360 a fortnight, an increase of around $130 a fortnight in assumed income. Under the income test, your pension reduces by 50 cents.
For every dollar of deemed income above the current free area of $226 a fortnight. Under the old frozen rates, your deemed income was barely above that free area, so the reduction was minimal. Under today's rates, your deemed income sits well above it, and the reduction is considerably larger, potentially a difference of around $60 to $65 a fortnight compared to what you'd have received under the frozen rates. Over a full year, that can add up to well over $1,000 in reduced pension, purely because deeming rates changed, and the impact scales up further for people with larger savings balances. Here's the part most people who retired before 2020 aren't thinking about, and it could actually be working for them right now. When deeming rates were frozen at historic lows and savings accounts were paying next to nothing, plenty of pensioners were effectively being penalized because their actual returns were lower than even the frozen deeming rate. But the situation has flipped for many people. The current upper deeming rate is 3.25%, while many term deposits available today are paying 4.5, even 5%. That means if your savings are earning more than the deeming rate, Centrelink is actually underestimating your income, and you're keeping the difference without it touching your pension. In other words, if your term deposit is paying 4.5% and Centrelink is only deeming 3.25%, you may genuinely be better off under today's system than you were when rates were frozen and your savings were earning almost nothing. The question every pre-2020 retiree needs to ask is which side of that line they're on, earning above the deeming rate, where the system favors you, or below it, where Centrelink is overestimating your income and your pension is lower than it should be. Frank retired in 2019 and had been on a part pension ever since. His savings were split between a term deposit paying 4.2% and a savings account paying 2.1%,
with total financial assets of $420,000. When we worked through it, his blended actual return sat around 3.4%, just above the current upper deeming rate of 3.25%, meaning the system was actually working slightly in his favor. But there was a second issue. His Centrelink record still reflected an asset balance from 18 months earlier, before he'd reinvested a matured term deposit at a better rate. More importantly, his savings account balance on file was around $32,000 higher than his actual current balance, because he'd been gradually drawing it down to supplement his pension, without ever updating Centrelink. That extra $32,000, deemed at 3.25%, was generating over $1,000 a year in assumed income that simply didn't exist, quietly reducing his pension by hundreds of dollars a year for no reason other than an outdated figure sitting in his file. The rules have shifted significantly since you first applied. Deeming rates have moved well off their frozen lows, thresholds have been updated repeatedly, and payment rates have risen. The entire landscape behind your pension calculation looks different today than it did when you first retired. And your Centrelink record, the exact information being used to calculate your payment right now, may still reflect a financial position that's months or years out of date. If your savings have dropped because you've been drawing on them to cover living costs, Centrelink doesn't know unless you tell them, and your pension stays lower than it should be. If you've restructured your savings, switched providers, or changed term deposit arrangements, Centrelink may not have the current picture either. If you retired before 2020, here's exactly what to check. First, log into MyGov today and review every financial detail Centrelink holds for you: bank balances, term deposit balances and maturity dates, share values, superannuation if you're over pension age, and investment.
Property values, comparing each one to your actual current figures. Second, if any balance has dropped, update it immediately, because a lower balance means lower deemed income and a higher pension, but Centrelink will never make that adjustment automatically. Third, work out which test is currently limiting your payment, the income test or the assets test, since Centrelink pays whichever produces the lower amount, and knowing which one applies tells you where changes to your finances will matter most. Fourth, run your numbers through the Services Australia online pension estimator and compare the result to what you're actually receiving. If the estimator shows a higher figure, your details on file are likely outdated, and correcting them could mean an immediate increase to your payment. Fifth, keep an eye on the next deeming rate review due around the 20th of September 2026, because whether rates move again and by how much will depend on your specific asset balance, and understanding your position now means no surprises when that date arrives. Frank updated his savings account balance with Centrelink that same afternoon. Within 2 weeks, his payment had risen, not dramatically, but enough to cover his monthly electricity bill every single month, simply because Centrelink finally had the right figure. He told me afterwards he'd always assumed Centrelink just knew what he had, and never thought to check. That assumption, that Centrelink already knows, is the most expensive assumption Australian pensioners make. Centrelink knows only what you tell them, nothing more. And if you retired before 2020 and haven't thoroughly reviewed what's on file, there's a very real chance they're working from outdated information that's costing you money right now. Check today and update today, because money that's rightfully yours will not come looking for you. If this video helped you, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more
pensioners who need this information. Subscribe to Australia Pension Hub so you never miss an update, and we'll be covering the next deeming rate review the moment it's announced. Drop a comment and tell me when you retired and when you last checked what Centrelink actually has on file for your financial assets. I read every single one. And share this with someone you know who retired before 2020 and is on the pension, because the rules have changed significantly since they first applied, and they deserve to know what that means for their payment right now.